Tēnā koe e te manga e tēnā koutou e te whare. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to speak to the specificity or sections of the bill that comes up for vote later today, but I will, however, speak to the general thrust. Yesterday, in the reading of the government's bill, which obviously concerns a similar topic, that of medicinal cannabis, I heard a number of National Party MPs stand up and critique that government's bill. Today, they have the opportunity to fill those gaps. I heard Dr. Jonathan Coleman refer to the government's bill as half-baked. I heard Dr. Shane Reti refer to a conversation that New Zealanders want to have, saying that they, the National Party, wanted to have it as well. Mr. Speaker, all members in this House have experienced the pain and the suffering of a loved one, of a family member or of a close friend. And I ask the members of this House, in considering the bill later today, to put themselves in another person's shoes. This issue is bigger than politics, or the likes of the political suffering with regard to the wounds of political pride that are so often dashed across the headlines in the media. What we are talking about today is the House of Representatives' role as a gatekeeper to a broader conversation that New Zealanders can have at the Select Committee stage. Mr. Speaker, I ask the House, is it better in the current situation, under the current legal framework, to be a bystander to the pain of a loved one when the only medicine that works for them is medicinal cannabis? Or is it better, is it more ethical to break that law? The reason that I mention this is because I think it is crucially important to raise the point that the law is not natural when people are in pain or in suffering. Indeed, the law is man-made, and we in this House have the opportunity to make that law, to put it right when it is wrong. Mr. Speaker, today I had the privilege to meet a number of patients, those whom could benefit from legalisation around medicinal cannabis use, as is outlined in my bill, and those who are currently breaking the law in order to get the relief that they need. I spoke with a young woman, Grace, whose family currently only is able to access medicinal cannabis by way of fundraising, the $1,200 a month that it costs to get the product through the Ministry of Health. Her family believes that the best course for this House to chart forward is to vote my bill through to Select Committee so that members may hear their case.
Order. I know that the member has been briefed on anticipating debates, and I've been listening very carefully, and this is about the third or the fourth time that she has referred to her bill and asked members to consider matters relating to it. Can I ask her to stick to the general principles of the issue and not to refer to the bill again?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. I will then refer to the point of conscience. This, as you have confirmed, will be a conscience vote. And I ask that members consider their conscience. There have been many issues before this House where members have been asked to vote in conscience, the likes of gay marriage, for example, where I think it's important to note that our former Prime Minister, Bill English, mentioned recently, last year I believe, that he probably would have voted differently now, knowing the impact that the passage of that law has had on society, that the sky did not fall in, that people had access to equality. I simply ask that members consider their conscience and vote in line with that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. E te mangai, tēnā koe, tuatahi ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohi, te Aotea te awa. Tēnā koutou, Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa. Mr. Speaker, congratulations on your new position. I am immensely proud to be entering this 52nd Parliament at such a time where you've actively sought to make the House more family-friendly, to create a new normal. There's been some critics of our having babies in this House. It's a place of work, they say. Children do not belong in the midst of arguing. I think perhaps these critics take for granted a nasty, adversarial culture. And I personally hope that the presence of babies helps remind us all of the gravity of our task and the lives our decisions impact. Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge my colleagues from Maungakiekie, new electorate MP Denise Lee, and my friend and New Labour MP Priyanka Radhakrishnan. I also want to acknowledge my incredible new Green colleague, who I am honoured to be entering this House with, Gauris Garama. Mr. Speaker, 4 years ago, I started hosting a little current affairs show on Auckland's #1 alternative radio station. I spent a long time interviewing politicians of all stripes on daily issues. But the underlying questions were always essentially the same. Firstly, how much do you understand this problem and the lives of the people affected beyond your briefing notes? And secondly, why should they trust you? With all due respect, Mr. Speaker, the answers were never really all too satisfactory. There was an innocuous response mechanism that I think is kind of bred into politicians. And with it, it's like we become out of sync with the orbit of people's daily lives. I don't think I would be alone in saying that I couldn't see myself, my friends, my whānau in politics. Mr. Speaker, young people don't have a monopoly on political disillusionment. It just happens that we listen to better music while feeling it. It's hard to engage in a system that doesn't look or sound like you, that talks down to you, that disparages your participation, and that you don't feel that you can change. The issue is, regardless of whether people choose to participate in this system, it governs their lives. Institutions don't have to look the way that they do. They're the sum of the people engaged and involved. Democracy doesn't have to feel broken. It is just a means, not an end unto itself. Mr. Speaker, the result of a few too many late-night Google spirals and discussions with friends who have always entertained my very left-of-field ideas led to me running for the Auckland mayoralty in 2016. I tried to make it about the people of Auckland to such an extent that I had a few people email me about the design of my posters, telling me that they couldn't read my name. But the slogan was, however, readable, and it read, "This is your city." I cut my teeth debating former Labour Party leader and my city's new mayor, Phil Goff. A journalist asked me if my running and my candidacy was a protest. I said, yeah, it kind of is. And they took that to mean that it was a joke. Mr. Speaker, I don't think protest is a joke. It is a method of organisation, of bringing people together around common purpose. It is a legitimate means to achieve tangible, meaningful outcomes, to make things better, to change. We have a history in Aotearoa of standing for things. Peaceful resistance at Parihaka, women's suffrage, nuclear-free New Zealand, anti-apartheid. Our country's political history is rich with protest. So, it shouldn't really come as a surprise to many in this House, but a few weeks ago, freshly minted as a new MP, I attended a protest. The next day, my dad texted me and told me that he'd heard people saying mean things about me on Talkback Radio. I had to call him and remind him that I'm in the Green Party. Whilst we've almost always been ahead of the policy curve, leading where others eventually follow, change is almost always uncomfortable. Change doesn't often come from the top. Change most frequently comes in the form of a groundswell by the people, for the people. The very reason that I stand in this chamber is because of the combined efforts of thousands of Green Party volunteers and activists across Aotearoa. I am here because of the staunch, tireless dedication to a kaupapa that recognises that the well-being of our people and our planet are inextricably linked. I am here because of the tenacity, the good humour and support of my campaign team, who turned up day in, day out, month after month after month. I am here to supplement the mahi of my lean, mean, green caucus. I am here to show people that politicians can look a little different, can speak a little different, can do things a little differently. To drive home the message that politicians work for people and the mind-boggling notion that politicians are people too. Mr. Speaker, anybody paying attention saw that this was a rough and generally rather exhausting campaign. And a week before Election Day, at my final debate, I broke down in tears. We were asked to speak about New Zealand's shameful suicide rate, particularly with regard to our youth, our rangatahi. Another candidate took this as academic, speaking in numbers and fiscals. And they were abstracting the lives and the loss of my friends. As I cried, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't help but realise that this mental health epidemic rippling through our communities is the logical endpoint of austerity, the consequence of decades of economic and social reform that has shredded communities, safety nets, and most fundamentally, care. It turns out, Mr. Speaker, that lives are more complicated than what may be written on a CV. I spent a lot of my teenage years struggling with anxiety and depression. The reason that I talk about this is not because my mental health history makes me a stronger person or has necessarily given me any insights into the world. Rather than making me special, a history of mental health issues rather makes me quite normal because, as I have said, these issues are pandemic in our society. We in this House have the power and the platform to help define normality. So I think that we have a responsibility to present ourselves as we really are, with our flaws intact. I understand that all of that is no small task when in this universe, we are supposed to be poised to jump at each other's jugular at the faintest sign of weakness. But things like kindness, as I am so impossibly proud that our new Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has put back on the agenda, is not weakness. It's human. I ask that we remember and reflect the people that we are serving. It is our job to empower them, not to insulate ourselves from their scrutiny. Too many of those that we serve and represent are navigating insecure housing and insecure work at the moment. When you don't know your neighbours or your co-workers to any depth, when you have a problem, you're not quite inclined to talk about it. You internalise it and you individualise it. It's your problem. It's therefore a problem with you. Without strong communities, without mainstream recognition of the power of collective action, Mr. Speaker, we don't hear each other's voices and we don't put our finger on systemic issues that affect us all and we need each other's help to solve. Mr. Speaker, there's this old joke. A fish is swimming up a river and it sees a dog standing on the bank and the dog says to it, "How's the water?" And the fish replies, "What water?" It's funny, you can laugh. The most fundamental realities of our lives are often the hardest to see, you see, and the hardest often to talk about. Kids from all over Aotearoa are brought up here and they sit in this gallery and they watch us in Parliament and the teachers tell them, this is politics. When question time is on the news, everyone sees the yelling and the screaming and they are told, this is politics. This is what politicians do. But what happens in this room is largely theatre. Politics is what happens when all of us in here go back to our rooms and we close our doors and we shake hands and we make decisions. The consequences of those decisions saturate our lives. These decisions inform who is rich and who is poor, who gets sick and who gets better. They decide what we eat and what we drink and the quality of the air that we breathe. They decide who has or may have a future and who does not. The consequences of political decisions are so pervasive in our lives that we don't really even see them anymore. So we in this room get to choose the rules. That means that those falling through the gaps at the moment are either there by systemic neglect or by design. It means that we as the Green Party, as one moving part of this great new government, have an opportunity, a duty to try and fix things. Mr. Speaker, when I was 11 years old, Mrs. Narby, an excellent teacher of mine in Form 1, made a point of telling off one of my friends. It was a Decile 3 intermediate and I was one of a handful of Pākehā kids. My Pacifica mate was looking down at his desk. She pointed out that this is what Pacifica kids are taught respect looks like. But to those suspended in the Pākehā world where eye contact is respect, would see this as rude. Because of this, she said, brown kids are treated not just as naughty, but as disrespectful by those who may not understand cultural cues. That is the tip of the iceberg of what systemic racism looks like, she taught us. With that lesson, I started understanding that this system, systems like this, are designed for people who look like me. That's what echoes of colonisation look like. If we are ever to heal those wounds, we need to look at them in broad daylight. They hurt and they are uncomfortable when we bandage them over because they require attention. Mr. Speaker, I am who I am because of my family. We might not share all of the same politics, but I was raised on a diet of robust and challenging discussion. To my dad, you gave me a toolkit of resilience. At 7 years old, writing my first speech on the double standards between kids and adults as only a petulant 7-year-old could, you taught me the value of putting myself in other people's shoes, that it is our perception that informs our reality. You showed me that nobody, not even a grumpy 7-year-old, is the centre of the universe. To my mum, you gave me my love of art, my love of reading, my love of theatre and film and creativity. You've shown me how our narratives do not necessarily, how our histories do not necessarily define our futures. To my little sister Grace and my little brother Ollie, I am stoked to be your big sister. Grace, I have appreciated how little you care about anything and everything to do with my job. I love using you as a sounding board for people who politics plays out on the periphery of their lives as white noise. Ollie, I love learning with you. It is such a privilege to hold the position of working on this education system in our country just as you're about to start at intermediate school. To my best friend and partner Alex, who could have imagined when we met nearly 6 years ago outside Philosophy 101 that this is where we would end up? Thank you for being my anchor amidst turbulence in life and in self-discovery. Thank you for being my home when I didn't feel that I had one. Thank you for putting up with me as I follow each and every new passion. Mr. Speaker, if I can accomplish just one thing in my time here, if I can change just one thing, I want to change people's awareness of what politics really is. Because if we can change that, everything else can change. I want to start that work here today by asking people to look critically at the world around them. Look at our culture and our society and our economy and ask if it is fair and just. If it's not, who profits from that injustice? Who pays the price for that unfairness? Because politics is not me standing here giving this speech. Politics is all around us. Like that old joke, politics is water. Politics lives in our relationships and our conversations and what we believe and what we're willing to fight for. Mr. Speaker, I stand here on the shoulders of giants like the Green pioneers Jeanette Fitzsimons and Rod Donald, and I am here to fight. Both here from my privileged position inside these walls and protesting out on the streets with the people I am proud to represent until nobody ever needs to fight again. E ai ki te whakatohi. Hi awa te mea nui o te ao. Hi tangata, hi tangata, hi tangata. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. Often, it's not really an elephant. It can feel like a black dog that follows one around, sucking the oxygen out of the air, slowing down time, or fast-forwarding the clock at such a pace that everything feels like it is going at lightning speed around your ears, blurring shapes and out of grasp. It can bring paralysis, self-doubt, and cold sweats. You can feel it in your head, but you cannot easily lift the lid and show it to other people, let alone find the words. In this house, we don't often talk about the breadth and depth and human face of mental health. We talk about statistics and we talk about data. Mental ill health, however, disproportionately affects our poorest, our most vulnerable, and our young people. But it directly or indirectly touches all of our lives. Everybody in this country, everybody in this room. We don't really talk about it though. We don't talk about the messy complexity and nuance. It makes us uncomfortable. We don't tackle it head on because we don't have all of the answers. No one does. We don't like to talk about it because it reminds us that the structures organising our society and indeed our economy are hurting our people. And radical change is required to fix things. And that's scary too. This week we've received media reports of the devastating loss of 6 lives in Porirua. My love and deepest sympathies go out to the whānau, friends, community, the people of Porirua and across Aotearoa New Zealand whose hearts are breaking. Today we have also heard that there has been a 25% increase in tertiary students accessing university counselling services in the past 2 years. 1 in 4 adults in New Zealand will be diagnosed with a mental health issue in their lives, but many more will struggle with it and never receive a formal diagnosis. These are the people and communities whose suffering is unconscionable, people and communities who need our support. These people are not broken. It is our systems and the society of those systems that govern us that are. It's not empty political rhetoric. That's what the mounting literature and studies tell us, that the causes of mental illness are from the same thing. The majority of mental health issues are triggered by environmental causes, and even of those with pre-existing conditions, with chemical imbalances, have those conditions exacerbated by environmental factors. And surprisingly, those environmental factors are not as complicated as we sometimes may like to think. We know who gets sick. People who are isolated, those who are under financial pressure, in insecure employment, in abusive relationships, living in transient or substandard housing, people without a home. People who feel displaced, who grapple for identity, who cannot see a safe and secure future in their grasp. These are the people who are most likely to experience mental illness. But I said earlier that we don't often talk about mental illness in this house. But the things that we do talk about, housing, the economy, drugs, healthcare, crime, welfare, education, the corrections system, all are conversations about mental health, because these are the fundamental drivers of mental ill health and the epidemic in our community. The conditions for the epidemics and the anxiety and the depression have been manufactured here, inside this political system, because political decisions have made that environment. But we don't easily acknowledge that. Usually we talk about individual resilience. Our education system removes difficult children from their classrooms. Our health system is primed to medicalise. This makes us more comfortable than confronting decades of decline in state services and community, the rise of competition and isolation and inequality. Mental illness is messy and complex. There are no simple solutions. Words cannot do justice for those who've lost a loved one. Words alone will never do justice. Action is necessary and it is urgent. And Mr. Speaker, in November this year, this House will receive recommendations from a wide-ranging mental health and addiction inquiry. That presents us with a roadmap. I am calling out to colleagues across this House to work together to implement those findings to improve New Zealanders' well-being. Mr. Speaker, it's our job. Mr. Speaker, the synthetics crisis, as was just referenced, continues to grip this country, and today I invite all members of this Parliament to live up to their rhetoric. There is consensus here, at least as far as words go, that we do not want to criminalise users. We want to see harm reduced. We want to stop unnecessary deaths. So let's prove that with action. I am calling on MPs across this House and all parties today to support sensible drug regulation that stops harm and prevents unnecessary deaths. If politicians aren't willing to do that, Mr. Speaker, then we cannot pretend that we are treating this as a health issue. And let's be honest with ourselves. Increasing penalties, the punishment pathway, the war on drugs simply has not worked. In 1998, when I was 4 years old, member states of the United Nations signed up to eradicate all drugs by committing to strong, unsympathetic penalties. We told ourselves that if we played by this rulebook, we would get rid of drugs on planet Earth by 2008. That was 10 years ago, and drugs still exist. While we've been ratcheting up criminal penalties, we've done nothing to reduce the harm that drugs are causing in our community. Drug use flourishes in the shadows, providing billions of dollars internationally in funds for violence and organised criminal activity, leaving destruction in its wake. Last year, synthetic drugs were implicated in 27 deaths in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this year, the death toll has risen to at least 45 lives lost. If these deaths were caused by anything else, anything other than those evil, scary, illegal drugs, we'd be stepping in immediately to regulate harm. Instead, we're stuck in this punishment feedback loop. We're seeing more of the same political thinking that got us into this mess in the first place. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to appeal directly to members' consciences on this issue. Every few months, MPs in this House are asked by the media when they last smoked cannabis. There's a wee chuckle and a few ums and ahs, and then we all gaze off into the distance and refer back to our university days. But what about our fellow New Zealanders, Mr. Speaker? What about those who weren't so fortunate to go to university? What if you can't choose to leave illegal drug consumption in the mists of time? What if those drugs had killed us? What if we were strapped with drug convictions? What if it took away our future? But it didn't, for us. And we're here, a substantial number of us who have personally admitted to breaking the law and consuming illegal drugs. And now we preside over that law which penalises people who engage in exactly the same behaviour for doing what we did. Some people are ending up in jail, and now some people are dying. But we are in Parliament with the ability to do something. So what are we going to do? We can, of course, continue to pretend that everything is fine with a criminalisation that is applied on an ad hoc basis and disproportionately against the poor, against the young, against Māori. But what exactly is the purpose of penalising drug users? Is it that we want to stop people using drugs? Well, if that's the case, we're failing. Big time. New Zealand is reported to have amongst the highest drug use rates in the world, according to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. Is it that we somehow think that illegality will spur people to access help for abuse and addiction issues? Well, the Ministry of Health data shows that 16.5% of New Zealanders who sought help for drugs couldn't access it for fear of law or the police. Is it that we think that we're somehow getting cost-saving measures out of locking people up who use these drugs? Well, the evidence in independent fiscal modelling released today shows that criminalising drug users alone costs between $34 million to $83 million a year. I am calling on MPs across this House to move to support an end of punishment for people who use drugs and provide them with resourcing and support. Because if politicians aren't willing to do that, we cannot pretend that we are treating this as a health issue. We cannot pretend that we care about people who use drugs and the harm that they experience. If we continue to criminalise drug users, we are condemning them for not living up to the moral standards that we ourselves admit that we are not able to meet. Kia ora. The most transformational change to our drug law in this country in over 30 years, because this bill will save lives. However, Madam Speaker, I won't sit here and be lectured on ethics and morals by National Party members like Simeon Brown, who only a few months ago went on the record at a debate with myself and Labour Party member Dr. Deborah Russell, speaking about how he believes people like me and my partner, a same-sex couple, should not be allowed to get married, be afforded the same rights as him and his wife. Mr. Simeon Brown, you are welcome to hold your opinions, but I think that it's important that you and your National Party colleagues recognise that when you are here in this House, the positions that you hold...
Sorry to interrupt the member. Point of order, Simeon Brown.
Exactly what any of that has to do with this piece of legislation, and also she continues to refer to bring you into the debate.
Thanks for your helpful advice, Mr. Brown. If you could return to the bill.
Absolutely, Madam Speaker. The point that I was trying to make is that when Mr. Simeon Brown stands here in this House and grandstands his opinions, his political rhetoric, it doesn't just impact him. It impacts the real lives of everyday New Zealanders who are out there on the streets, including those who deal with synthetics addiction problems. Primarily, actually, as far as this goes, the homeless, jobless, young men who are pushed further into the shadows, who have been the victims of this drug. Madam Speaker, former Green Party health spokesperson Kevin Haigh warned with the passage of the 2014 amendment of the Psychoactive Substances Act, which ripped synthetics out of a regulated supply and placed them into the unregulated black market. He said, and I quote, "There will be an increased supply of currently illicit drugs. We are going to see a significant increase in harm." And unfortunately, Kevin Haigh was right. Madam Speaker, I want to take a moment to address all of the hot air being blown by the opposition in this debate, because they're saying on the one hand that police already use this discretion, and on the other hand that it presents no change. However, they are also saying that this is simultaneously a stealthy and transformational law. I'll help them to reconcile that. What this law does is codify police discretion that officers already use. The problem is that different people use different drugs for different reasons, and different police prosecute different people differently in different regions. Because it is currently an ad hoc, unarticulated power, it is impromptu. There is barely a rule of thumb. It is unspoken, there is no transparency, and there is therefore, Mr. Brett Hudson, no accountability. The police themselves say this. They recognise that they have this power currently. But it's uncertain because it doesn't currently have to be reported, and it's applied without the need to rationalise. Or, more importantly, it is often not applied where it in the first place should be. So, to help my National Party colleagues along, that's where the transformational part comes in. Because Clause 6 of this bill amends Section 7 of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975, which outlines the offence of possession and use of all drugs. The change we are voting through tonight codifies police discretion, explicitly highlighting, and I'll quote from the bill itself to help the National Party, that, and I quote, prosecution should not be brought unless it is required in the public interest, where, and I quote, consideration should be given to whether a health-centred or therapeutic approach would be more beneficial. The police discretion, which is presently applied on a casual basis, will now be explicitly available universally to all police officers in this country. The police will enforce standards. We will collect data. And if there is bias and prejudice, as some who submitted to the Select Committee noted is often the case in prosecution, we will be able to pinpoint it through bald-faced evidence and information, and we will be able to fix it. A year and a half ago, since this issue was first brought to Parliament, I hope that the opposition is finally starting to get a grasp on it, because there is nothing so upfront and straightforward, something that's been so critiqued and so scrutinised through the marathon and under the microscope that is the Select Committee and parliamentary process. Because, Madam Speaker, almost always the debate around drug law reform gets personal. Last night, the Honourable Michael Woodhouse patronised me for giving him a lecture when I addressed misinformation being circulated by the opposition on the expert advisory panel. In the second reading, he told me to go back to constitutional school. Not quite sure what that is. The Honourable Paula Bennett has regularly mischaracterised me as pro-drugs, preferring to skirt around debate on the evidence and dive straight into ad hominem attacks. So, Madam Speaker, let's get personal. Really personal. Because I know firsthand the harm that substances can cause, but more importantly than that, I know that our responses that we create here in Parliament can either increase or decrease that harm. When we introduced this bill to the House, I spoke about Tyrone Smith and how the net of stigma and punishment we weave stitch up the lives of those who abuse drugs and can see them leave us all too soon. But tonight, Madam Speaker, I want to talk about a flatmate of mine that I lived with several years ago. I will not name him. This young man had moved to Auckland from regional New Zealand looking for work. Without forging strong community connections, he spent a lot of time on the internet. We found out later that on chat rooms, he started asking about where to find tinny houses. He found one, but he didn't find cannabis. Where cannabis wasn't available, he found that synthetics were. It was cheaper and it didn't come up in drug tests. He further withdrew and isolated himself. He turned to more synthetics because they were reliable comfort, and they helped him not to feel anything at all. A few weeks later, his dad came to take him because we were all worried about him. We were notified a few weeks later that he took his life that next week. We didn't know anything about the drugs until his dad called us, and we learnt about his passing. There wasn't a meaningful opportunity to intervene in this young man's drug abuse. He didn't tell anyone because he was ashamed of it, and because he was ashamed of it, he withdrew further, he isolated himself, and he continued turning to harder drug use. The dealer only cared about making as much money as possible. My flatmate's quality of life meant absolutely nothing. The dealer had no duty of care. Madam Speaker, in a society that thrives on ostracising and alienating oddballs, drug dealers have plenty of prey for comfort. Madam Speaker, tonight is for my flatmate, tonight is for Tyrone Smith, tonight is for all of these men's families, for all of the victims of the war on drugs for whom the state owes a well overdue apology, and for those who suffer from mental health and addiction issues who will no longer be swept under the carpet, out of sight and out of mind. This law is a triumph for evidence-based policy. It is a triumph for compassion, and it is a triumph for common sense. Madam Speaker, 16 years ago, former Green Party MP Nandor Tanksos contributed to the debate on increasing penalties for methamphetamine. The Greens were the only party in Parliament to oppose merely increasing penalties because, in Nandor's words, and I quote, it would do nothing. In fact, it will be worse than doing nothing. It will distract from the real issue of how we really deal with these problems. There are a lot of things that we can do if we want to address the methamphetamine issue. We could put more money into drug education, and we have to put more money into treatment. Nandor Tanksos was right. 16 years ago, we increased penalties alone. Politicians rested on their laurels and more harm occurred. More lives were ruined and more people died. Tonight, we end that ridiculous political precedent. We do something that actually matters. Madam Speaker, in my final minutes, I want to extend a massive mihi and thank you to our Green Party of Aotearoa political advisors, particularly Holly Donald, the Prime Minister of my heart, to Ralph Hall, and to my executive assistant, Tim Onnes. And I can't help but shout out to the one, the only, Rob Beaglehole. I want to thank, Madam Speaker, all of the Green MPs who came before this caucus to carry this kaupapa. I want to thank all of the patients, the police, the addicts, the mental health and addiction workers, the NGOs and whānau who spoke out. Madam Speaker, the arc of moral history is long, but today it finally bends towards justice. Kia ora. Tēnā koe e te manga e tēnā koutou e te whare. Madam Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise on behalf of the Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand this afternoon in support of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission Bill. In doing so at this, the third reading, after which we will be passing through royal assent and the Commission will fully and finally be realised, moving on from its interim stage at present. I just want to recognise all of the mahi which the Chair of the Health Select Committee, Louisa Wall, has echoed in recognising those who came before the Select Committee and had their voices heard, as well as those who contributed to Hiara Oranga, the government inquiry into mental health and addiction. But alongside that, I want to recognise those who have championed this in the political and the advocacy and the activism spheres for such a long time. And I also want to recognise former Green MP Kevin Haig, who as health spokesperson for the Greens fought really hard against the original disestablishment of of the Mental Health Commission. But what we're talking about today, Madam Speaker, with the establishment of this Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission, is the establishment of a commission, of an entity that will essentially be a watchdog, that will hold our governments and future governments to account for their implementation of policies, of funding, of law, and the impact that that has on the mental health of New Zealanders, particularly those who have been identified in this legislation as particularly of need. Madam Speaker, I want to just actually stipulate that all of us have mental health. We often talk about mental health as though it's this kind of thing that's out there, that we only ever talk about it when it is poor. But in the same way that all of us have physical health, we have mental health. And I actually think that this is perhaps best recognised in a tikanga Māori model of health, the haora, which recognises social well-being, physical well-being, spiritual and mental or emotional well-being. All of those things as being interconnected and all interdependent for well-being at large. And actually, I think we need to recognise that the mental ill health crises that we presently have in this country is the logical consequence of what occurs when you start to deprioritise certain elements of that hora model. This is what happens when we try and disconnect individuals from their communities. This is what happens when people don't have a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and a sense of identity. And I think that hopefully in the wake of COVID-19, as we come into this place of recovery as a country, that we're starting to recognise how deeply interconnected and interdependent we all are as communities across Aotearoa, New Zealand. And funnily enough, on the point around this interconnection and the importance of our physical, our emotional, our community, that being our social and our spiritual well-beings, that interconnection is actually core green kaupapa. Oftentimes we're critiqued as a party for not only focusing on the environment, but also talking about the social and community issues that people in this country face. And Mr. Speaker, I guess in threading that needle to the prominence and importance that this Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission will have moving forward, it is to recognise fundamentally that all of this stuff is connected, and hopefully that we can continue that conversation with a semblance of the nuance that it is owed as we move forward. Mr. Speaker, of course, this was one of the many recommendations out of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Government Inquiry, the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry, that is, that was titled He Ara Oranga. And I think that that report was groundbreaking in and of itself, because for the first time, even though we'd had multiple, actually, over the past few decades, we've had multiple inquiries into the state of our mental health services. This was the first one that was given the mandate to look beyond solely the individual clinical forms of treatment that we may respond with as a society, as a health system, or as politicians. It was groundbreaking because it looked at individuals as part of society. It was groundbreaking because it looked at the features and the factors and the attributes and the characteristics of one's life that can lead them to experiencing poor mental health. And it therefore recognised that mental ill health does not occur in a vacuum. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it reflected swathes of contemporary research which showcases that people's environments are largely determinative of poor mental ill health. Interestingly, in the same way that poor physical environments can be determinative of poor physical health. And again, this is the critical point that I need all of us to really reflect on today, is that all of this stuff is connected and none of it happens in a vacuum. Mr. Speaker, now, recognising the change of the speakers, we're stoked as the Greens that this is passing today. We're stoked because we hope that it is the start of the journey of the recognition in a systemic, institutional way that mental ill health isn't happening in this vacuum over or out there, but in fact it is deeply embedded in our lives and in society at large. Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the Minister of Health, Dr. David Clark, for his mahi in working actually across the House, from my understanding, and in speaking to the members of the newly formed Mental Health and Addiction Wellbeing Cross-Party Group. This is important, and this will be really important to a lot of people. So I hope that we don't take this as just lip service, having ticked it off the list, but in fact what we're establishing today is an institution that will hold us all to account and make sure that we bloody well are holding ourselves to the promises that we are making. Mr. Speaker, very happy to commend this bill to the House. Mr. Speaker, a pleasure to rise and speak after Tim McIndoe, the Honourable Tim McIndoe, after his contributions with regard to his constituency. There's been a number of MPs and ministers across this House who have shouted out to their constituencies. And I, as one of the younger members in this chamber, am actually amongst a constituency that a number of members of all age demographics are engaged in, and that is one of students. There are a number of members of Parliament across this House that are actually currently engaged in a postgraduate course at Victoria University of Wellington, Mr. Speaker. I see my colleague, Kiritapu Allen, over there looking incredibly stoked about our class later tonight. But Mr. Speaker, to get to the core point that I'm really hoping to put across in this very brief speech today, fundamentally, I think that all of us in here can agree that education is a passport. It is an opportunity or a pathway to social mobility, to travel, to future opportunities, to contribution. And the Greens strongly believe that it is the right of all of us to be able to access that education in this country entirely unencumbered and barrier-free. Everybody should have the opportunity to unlock that passion, that potential, that talent that exists inside of all of us, regardless of the backgrounds that we come from, and to walk into the future with that education unencumbered by the anchor of debt around their neck. Mr. Speaker, this is an entirely possible reality because, in fact, student debt was only introduced in 1992. It was a choice to do that. And since then, student debt in this country has ballooned to $16 billion. The New Zealand University Students' Association actually held a Sweet 16, kind of lamenting exactly that fact earlier this year. The average balance for all of those who have student loans around this country is on average more than $22,000 per person. That is an immense amount of money for younger people in particular, but also those who have lost their livelihoods and who are seeking to retrain to carry into the future as they seek to contribute. And Mr. Speaker, nowhere has this commodification of the education system, the higher education system, the tertiary education system, heck, even in apprentices and in polytechs, has this been more obvious than in the commodification of student accommodation. It is an issue that has been brought to light, particularly in the mainstream media over the past few weeks. And I have to say, as one of the members across this House, and I'd like to acknowledge actually my colleague, the Honourable Dr. Shane Reti, who as well has decided to throw his weight behind supporting students who are seeking to not have to pay for accommodation that they are not using, that the more that I have dug into this situation, as a Member of Parliament with supposedly all of the resources that are open to us, all of the doors that are supposed to be open to us, how untransparent, how unaccountable, and how precarious a house of cards the current situation is with student accommodation in this country. I have found out that there is an absolute patchwork of approaches, not only in the 8 university institutions across this country, but also in the polytechs. We've discovered, for example, that the 2 provided private institutions by way of the Auckland University of Technology, otherwise known as AUT, actually is sold on to investors which are able to use that accommodation in a kind of timeshare type of way. And they are essentially being guaranteed yield by those who are selling it on as investment, with students, again, being those who end up holding the bill in situations of turmoil. Students who are in the student accommodation also are unable to access regular consumer protection. They don't have recourse to the tenancy tribunal. In fact, the only avenue that is available to them as a form of protection is the recently passed interim domestic pastoral care legislation, which came into effect on the 1st of January this year. And even, Mr. Speaker, that has proved ineffective. Fundamentally, that is the tip of the iceberg, but it proves that we need massive reform in this sector. We need to do massive changes in terms of increasing investment in our future.